Gundams, humongous mecha, dreadnoughts, Battlemechs. There are two things everyone agrees about these giant sci-fi war machines. One, they are insanely cool, and two, they are insanely stupid. Yup, we're going to spend an entire trope analysis talking about giant mechs. For the purpose of this video, we're going to focus exclusively on mechs that are entirely technological. We are not here to argue about whether or not Talos from Greek mythology counts as a mech. We're also not going to count chicken walkers, like the AT-ST in Star Wars or the Sentinels of the Astra Militarum. Because a small, fast scout walker with no arms isn't anywhere near as impractical as a big, stompy robot. No, we're here to figure out how to reconcile the stupidity of a battle mech with the fact that they're too darn cool to exclude from science fiction. Why is a mech such a stupid design, you might ask? Well, for three reasons. One, legs on a combat vehicle are stupidly expensive to build compared to tank treads. Or, wheels. Two, combat vehicles are designed with a low center of gravity for a good reason. Making the vehicle as low to the ground as possible makes it hard to tip the thing over, and it also spreads out the weight distribution. There are a surprising number of combat vehicles in real life, even in the modern world, that cannot drive off of paved roads without sinking into the ground due to the weight of the vehicle, which is placed on too narrow of a surface for any other kind of ground to support the vehicle's weight. And the third reason why mechs aren't a good idea in real life is that they're unnecessarily tall. Tanks are kept low to the ground, in part because it allows them to take advantage of various types of cover, be it a low wall, or a fence, what have you. You'd be surprised at how easily most anti-armor weapons throughout history could be stopped by the most random of barriers. Most anti-armor weapons really need to hit their targets directly, or try to be as perpendicular as possible with the target's armor, or it risks bouncing off the target. This is why sloped armor exists. So even a piece of plywood between a vehicle and an anti-tank missile can knock the projectile off target and cause it to fail. A giant mech can't really take cover unless it's in a city, and a lot of mech designs leave the crotch region vulnerable to an RPG from an enemy soldier near the legs. That is one major design flaw compared to the vehicles we have in real life. Now, it is worth noting that the US military is already working on walking tanks and robot walkers, so it's not like we have to dig too far deep for an excuse to include mechs in a fictional setting. Admittedly, this thing is a long ways off from the kinds we see in the Battletech universe, but you never know. As long as there is a military-industrial complex, there will be taxpayer money flushed down the well of ridiculous combat vehicle designs. Speaking of which, history has actually shown us that governments will spend a lot of money building military hardware that is both large and unwieldy. During World War I, both the British and the Germans are guilty of constructing naval ships called dreadnoughts that were so expensive they were too afraid to actually risk losing them in battle. And when World War II rolled around, nobody apparently learned their lesson because the Germans commissioned the even larger and more expensive battleship known as the Bismarck, and the Japanese built the Yamamoto, and they both had the same problem, to the point where the Yamamoto never actually saw battle with another naval vessel before it was torpedoed to death by US bomber planes, and the Bismarck mainly sailed in circles around the Northern Sea until it was sunk by British planes. The one exception to this pattern of building expensive battleships that we weren't willing to risk in battle was the United States itself. Due to the fact that we were able to build an entire battleship in a day, the Americans were more than willing to send its bigger toys into battle, since our admirals had the mindset that we could always make more. Of course, mechs are on a completely different level when it comes to design. For a better comparison of stupid ideas, we need to look at one of the weirdest tank designs of World War I. This is the Tsar tank, built by the Russians and designed by Nikolai Lebedenko. Yes, it really had a pair of giant Ferris wheels. It's the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen, and it wasn't just a concept or something out of a steampunk novel. They actually built one and tried to test the Tsar tank out. Just take another look at this thing. Want to take a guess as to where the center of gravity is? This thing was bristling with guns, like turrets in every possible location, all held up by these two massive wheels and a single leg with back wheels for support. Now, on paper, and in a scale model, the Tsar tank actually worked. As in, Nikolai built a toy version of this thing, wound it up with a spring motor, and showed it traversing a variety of obstacles like books on a table. And it worked, in a way, as long as it was restricted to the toy-sized model. But as soon as they tried to do this with a life-size version, The Tsar tank ran afoul of the square cube law, which roughly says that when you increase the scale of something by a factor of x, the surface area increases by x squared, and the volume increases by x cubed. And it's the volume that determines how much mass the object has, while the surface area determines how that weight gets distributed. In sum, the entire weight of the tank was now being distributed among 3 very small points of pressure. So, the instant it tried to cover ground that wasn't completely dry, it sank into the mud, and none of the other vehicles around could help pull it out. There is still an example of the Tsar tank at the T-34 Museum in Russia, and in all fairness, the Tsar tank wasn't that bad of a design for its day. Tanks were invented during World War I, and Russia didn't have a lot of working examples to compare their design to. But it highlights one of the problems with a mech: too much weight on too small of an area for support. And it also shows us that it's not just moronic governments with a military-industrial complex flushing money down a toilet that leads to designs like this. Sometimes, the idea made sense on paper, and maybe even as a model, just not in the real world. And I know what you're thinking. As sci-fi writers, it's not our job to necessarily make everything about a mech work exactly like it would in real life. It's cool. Just turn your brain off and enjoy the show. If you want to go the Gundam route, screw physics. Bring out the coolest mech toys you can think of. But if you're writing hard science fiction, you need it to be at least believable. Mechs should fit within the realm of realism your story is trying to create, and avoid breaking the audience's suspension of disbelief as much as possible. And to that end, I'd like to introduce you to my favorite mech in the lore of the Battletech universe. Is it the eponymous, awe-inspiring Atlas? It is not. Is it the Fafnir, with its twin heavy Gauss rifles that'll punch a hole in anything it shoots at? It is not. Is it the highly flexible Mad Cat, the clan Omni-Mech known for its versatility? It is not. Nay, my favorite mech in the lore of Battletech is the Muckraker. Okay, Sarna.net only has a picture of the modified version outfitted for combat, but here's the unmodified version. It's literally a dump truck on legs. I said this was my favorite mech in the lore, not on the tabletop or the video games. But there's a few interesting stats worth noting about the Muckraker. First, it's registered as a heavy mech, weighing 70 tons at its maximum capacity. But that's after loading 22 tons of minerals into the bucket on top. Additionally, the mech is listed as having stable as a design quirk, which translates into the mech being difficult to knock over or knock down from melee or ramming attacks. So, this is a mech that was deliberately designed to be able to remain gyroscopically stable, even with a change in its total weight of about 22 tons. These are all incredibly useful pieces of technology in a machine like this, even before you start thinking about putting weapons on it. The thing about the Muckraker is that it's kind of self-explanatory. You don't really need to ask why someone would build a mech like this. A mining company wanted a dump truck that could go places a normal truck couldn't, so they built one of these. It was probably cheaper than building a set of roads on every plant that the company wanted to strip mine. And while I know this isn't what happened in the background lore of Battletech, it is entirely plausible that a corporation would design a mech like this, and then the mining facility got invaded by pirates, somebody mounted guns on a Muckraker, and from that, they could have discovered how to build Battlemechs. In real life, it wasn't the military that invented caterpillar treads, or the internal combustion engine, or even motorized vehicles. Those were all developed in the private sector, and the British military put them together in World War I. Mechs would probably develop the same way. It almost makes too much sense for that not to happen. Inserting things like this into the background of your lore could easily make mechs more believable in hard science fiction. Also, railguns. We need more railguns, Gauss rifles, and other magnetic-based weapons on mechs, because they don't have any recoil, and the recoil on a conventional cannon on a mech would be an absolute mess, especially if the cannon is located anywhere above the mech's center of gravity. Railguns, lasers, and missile launchers. Start with weapons that have no recoil, both in your background lore and in your own notes before you're working your way up to conventional cannons. Obviously, because they're cheaper, armies would want to mount combustion-based cannons on their mechs eventually. But getting that to work without the mech falling over backwards would take a lot more research and development. Although the modified Muckraker could probably handle it. That arm design could offset the recoil on that rotary autocannon. Another element that I recommend you steal from Battletech is the idea that different factions are going to have different military doctrines based on their own environments. For example, cultures in Battletech that tend to prefer to settle on colder, snowier planets tend to design mechs that generate a lot of heat, because they're used to the idea that the mech will be fine due to the cold weather around it. Adding extra heat sinks is a waste of time and tonnage. Meanwhile, planets that tend to rain a lot or have higher levels of humidity are terrible for lasers, so mechs designed by cultures on planets like that don't carry a lot of lasers and use more missile weapons. And then you get guys like Jacob Banson, who doesn't like buying fancy, expensive, untested toys, and instead has his mechs equipped with cheaper, often dirtier equipment. This guy puts diesel and internal combustion engines on his mechs when everyone else is using nuclear reactors. And sure, each individual mech mounted with such a low output engine isn't going to carry anything fancy like a PPC or a bunch of electronic equipment, but they're so much cheaper you can send in a whole army of them at a fraction of the price. There's also the fact that some mechs in Battletech, both in-universe and out, are recognized as bad designs, with one of the biggest offenders being the Jaeger mech. In the background lore, the Jaeger mech was built to be an improvement on the Rifleman, which suffered from issues of not carrying enough ammunition, huge heat problems, and not enough armor for extended skirmishes. But the Rifleman was effective at its role as a mobile anti-aircraft platform. It just wasn't that good as a frontline mech for fighting other battle mechs. The Jaeger mech, on the other hand, removed most of the laser weapons, replaced them with more ammunition, and solved two of the three problems. But any Battletech player, or anyone who's ever played any of the MechWarrior video games knows, adding more ammunition that explodes when it gets hit without improving the armor is a bad idea. And stripping the lasers off the thing just makes it more dependent on said ammo, and this gives the mech fewer options for hitting enemy aircraft. So the Jaeger mech is not only not able to serve as a frontline battle mech, it's actually worse than the Rifleman at being an anti-aircraft platform. This is exactly the level of thought I want to see put into the background lore of a giant mech franchise. I don't care if you're writing a story where the science is so soft you can spread it on a bagel. I want Gundams to have this amount of depth to their design. And I also want to see more mechs that use different numbers of legs. Yes, we're not done glazing Battletech. Look at some of these things. There's no reason why a four-legged robot wouldn't be utilized by militaries in a universe like this. And can we get some more media where they put a mech torso on top of a mech chassis, with the mech torso effectively taking the place of the tank turret? This is the best of both worlds. You've got all the firepower and coolness of a mech mounted on the mobility and stability of a tank. And finally, there's one more issue that needs to be addressed when it comes to mechs. Morale. Pop quiz. What's the best combat vehicle in the US military today? Well, on paper, it'd have to be something like a stealth submarine. One that can launch nuclear missiles while being completely undetectable by sonar. It's a completely invisible war machine which, even if you knew where it was, you still can't do anything about it unless you have the right equipment. It's not like you can just take an improvised explosive device and use it to fight a sub. And to top it all off, it's capable of delivering death with impunity on such a scale that no modern tank could hope to compete. And at the same time, the fact that these submarines are undetectable makes them absolutely worthless as a deterrent. Every military commander knows that the best weapon is the one you never have to fire, and that requires some kind of display of power. And sometimes, you need a weapon that you're willing to use just to show you mean business, without actually having to mean real business. In other words, having a few guided missiles full of nothing but common explosives to bomb an enemy nation when they step out of line is a lot better than having to resort to breaking out the nuclear warheads every time there's a conflict. Even a mech that isn't particularly well designed in-universe, or in real life, can intimidate the hell out of an enemy, particularly one that doesn't understand the engineering behind it or why it's a flawed design. This is actually a really common tactic in real life, relying on how uneducated or uninformed the other guy is to avoid conflict altogether, because the gun you're walking around with is actually just a stick, and you're hoping people don't notice. Sometimes it works. There was also a concept in World War II called Tiger Fear, where the German Tiger tank was the biggest, most terrifying vehicle on the battlefield. Despite the hefty cost to produce, difficulty to transport, and the mechanical and mobility issues of a vehicle of its size, the Tiger was so big and scary that it wasn't unheard of for Allied forces to retreat rather than face one. A giant mech would logically have the same effect. And on the flip side, Everyone's favorite scene in Space Marine 2 is when the Dreadnought shows up and starts kicking ass. There's something about seeing a massive walker show up on your side that makes the troops rally and push harder against the enemy. As a rallying unit, a mech can be a huge deal, and as long as nobody manages to exploit the thing's design flaws, it could turn the tide of battle. If you want to use mechs this way in your fiction, you want to ensure they get used for a specific role in sci-fi militaries. They're support units, not the main battle line. And that's all I had to say about giant mechs. I do have a few announcements, though. First, Heroes of Shannon 2 is currently available on Amazon. Because it stands at over 750 pages, I am in the process of splitting it into 2 parts. Those will be out soon. Second, I have discovered that AI cannot handle reading Arabic names aloud in an English text. I was looking at the possibility of using AI to help me generate an audiobook, but it looks like that's not going to work. The technology just isn't there yet. So I'm still taking offers for anyone willing to lend their voice to an audiobook. And finally, today's featured independent video game is called Mech Engineer. It is, hands down, the worst game I have played in 2024. And I tried Dustborn, so put that into perspective. This game has the worst interface I've ever seen. With no navigation assistance, no information regarding how to open tabs that you close, I had to restart several times just to get through the first mission. There is no tutorial, none of it is intuitive, and to top it all off, it's boring. The actual combat gameplay is boring as hell. When you actually get past the frustrating interface and manage to deploy your mechs into battle, you don't actually have to do anything but watch as your mechs either win or lose. As the year of our Lord, 2024, comes to a close, I implore you, do not buy Mech Engineer. This game sucks. Alright, that's all I have for today. Thank you all, and goodbye.